Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a new EBD seminar. Before I introduce our speaker today, just a couple of reminders. If you need a certificate of attendance, please write down your name in the chat and then send an email to seminars@ebd-CSIC.es. Also, if you want to make any questions to our speaker today, please write your questions in the chat, and afterwards, Irene Mendoza will be moderating the questions. So I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today. He is a Fulbright scholar here at EBD, and he is a Pacific PhD candidate at Oregon State University. His name is Ryan Baumbusch, and he works in the Pacific Northwest, which is a wonderful ecosystem, well, a bunch of ecosystems, and he's working with owls, and he's going to talk us about the trophic interactions and the between two different species of owls. Ryan, when you are ready, you can start. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Maria. Yeah, so like she said, this is research in progress for my PhD at Oregon State University, working with my advisors, Katie Duggar and David Weens. So jumping into it, going back a little bit in time, I know timescales are a little different, historical timescales are a little different between the US and Europe. But back in the middle of the 19th century, the United States was expanding. Here, this just sort of characterizes what was going on at the time. So we had large movements of people going across the continent. Some of the major migrations taking place were the Oregon Trail, where the US government was encouraging European Americans to go out to the Oregon Territory on the West Coast and set up farms. And then when gold was discovered in California, there was a large movement of people, not just across the country, but from around the world into California to mine that gold. But many people came over the overland route. And if you're not familiar with the basic geography of the United States, in the middle of the country, we have these open prairies, pretty treeless, vast open spaces. And then we have our Rocky Mountains moving towards the west. And then once you hit the West Coast, we had some large ancient forests. And this is what much of the landscape looked like out there. This is a redwood stand in California. If you've never been on the West Coast or been to these forests, they're just phenomenal. And pictures don't do them justice. And I encourage, if you have the chance, to go out there and see this. Just these massive, massive trees that are thousands of years old. But as European Americans were making their way out to the West Coast, we started cutting them down. And we did a pretty good job of taking down many of the old trees. Now, this is not to say that prior to Europeans arriving on the West Coast, this was an untouched, unmanaged landscape. Many of the early accounts of European Americans getting out there noted that the Native Americans that were already living on the landscape were managing the landscape. And one of the major ways they were doing that was through fire. There are accounts of just the Oregon Territory being completely covered in smoke during times of the year. There were various reasons that the Native Americans were doing this to manage the natural resources that they had out there. So as the decades progressed, initially we were using handsaws and rolling logs down into creeks to have creeks wash them out during the winter high flows. But then with the advent of the steam donkey pictured here, we were able to move logs upslope and along slopes, which gave access to new stands that could be cut and taken to market. And then with the railroad, we had new ways to move the timber that was being felled. And then with roads and trucks, again, we were able to move more timber out of the woods. And post-World War II, the industrialization of the timber industry just let us cut down pretty much anything we wanted, anywhere we wanted. So the result of that is these ancient forests with giant trees were getting reduced to bare hillsides. And if you're unfamiliar with this, I encourage you to go look at Google Earth, Google Maps, and there's some interesting results of this on the landscape where you get this checkerboard pattern, and this is due to the ownership. So we have some federal lands mixed in with private lands that were given out in this checkerboard pattern. And the private lands are intensively managed clear cuts, where currently the federal lands aren't being cut nearly as intensively. So you get this checkerboard pattern. So aside from the Native Americans that were living on the landscape, there are a lot of animals out there that had evolved to live in these old forests. So the spotted owl is something many of you are probably familiar with. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the northern spotted owl, a subspecies, but there are two other subspecies, California spotted owl, a little further to the south, and then the Mexican spotted owl with this patchy distribution throughout the Rocky Mountains and then down into Mexico. So the northern spotted owl, medium-sized, territorial forest owl, non-migratory, so it lives in its territories year-round, but outside of the breeding season, the boundaries collapse a little bit and it'll make forays a little bit farther from its core, but usually staying near that core territory. Long-lived, relatively low fecundity. Oftentimes they'll breed every other year, 1, maybe 2 nestlings per clutch. And forest obligate. So these guys live in the forest, they rely on the forest, they don't really use open or patchy habitats all that much. So as forests were getting cut, a lot of people didn't want forests to get cut. And the spotted owl kind of got caught up as a way of halting the harvest of some of the last old growth stands remaining in the Western US. So lots of protests, lots of counter protests about people who wanted to go out and cut down those trees, primarily because their jobs depended on that. We had lots of people going out, sitting in trees and doing what they could to defend them. And a lot of animosity grew up around this issue, and the spotted owl became a focus of it because it was a way to stop harvest of the old growth, but then it became a symbol of this conflict between people who wanted to retain the old growth and people who wanted to harvest it. And one of the culminations of this was people were going out and putting metal spikes into trees, which if you're cutting a tree with a chainsaw, really bad things are going to happen if you hit one of those spikes. So people were going out putting spikes into old growth trees to try and prevent them from keep loggers from cutting them down. So I'd like to say this all culminated with the listing of the spotted owl under the Endangered Species Act in 1990 as threatened. There's a higher classification of endangered, but that definitely was not the end of the story. So when that listing decision came through, that held up quite a few timber sales that were already in progress, but the units had not been harvested. And this got sent to some of the highest levels of our government in the US, where people like the Secretary of the Interior and Secretary of the Army, people that report directly to the president, were called in on a committee to try and decide what to do with these timber sales in Oregon and Washington. One of the results from that was that we needed a better way of managing forests in the Pacific Northwest going forward. So this Northwest Forest Plan was developed in 1994. Here we have all the different ecosystem units involved in that, scattered throughout essentially the range of the northern spotted owl. And then we also have, so that just manages federal lands. And then on private lands, we have habitat conservation plans that allow for take under the Endangered Species Act. Take can mean, killing an animal, but in this case, it means just altering or disturbing its habitat to the point that the spotted owls might not occupy that habitat anymore, or that area anymore. And then just tons and tons of research came about after its listing, and a monitoring network was established. So some of that research was looking at why spotted owls need these old growth forests. And some of the things we found were flying squirrels and tree voles, a species of vole that actually lives on conifer needles, consumes them. These species are strongly associated with the older forests in the Pacific Northwest, and these are the prey items that spotted owls, northern spotted owls especially, rely on. And then down here in the bottom right-hand corner, we have wood rats, which are also another great food resource for them. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a bit. Yep. So, and then dispersal, so understanding how spotted owls use the landscape, especially when they are living and reproducing in these old growth forests, but then have to pass through a matrix of all these cut over clear cuts and younger stands out there on the landscape. And then habitat associations. And this is from Franklin et al. 2000, which was one of my favorite papers. So all the research up until this point was suggesting spotted owls were just absolutely needed. Old growth habitat, we just needed to keep old growth habitat on the landscape for them. But then down in Northern California, they did this study where they were looking at the fitness, so survival and reproduction of spotted owls in different territories with different mixes of habitat and non-habitat. So what we see here are 3 examples of territories where the black is habitat and the white is not spotted owl habitat. And we see here in a territory that's almost all northern spotted owl habitat, they found lowest fitness, while up here with this mix of owl habitat and not owl habitat within their home range, they found actually much higher fitness, higher survival and reproduction. And what their conclusions were out of this was all of this non-habitat within the home range was great for wood rats. So the wood rats would live and reproduce outside of the spotted owl habitat, and they would just pour into the owl habitat and produce or provide just tons of food for the spotted owls, increasing their survival and reproduction of the spotted owls. So as the years progressed and we studied more, we found that it was a little more nuanced than just we need to protect and keep all the old growth trees on the landscape. And again, remember this matrix prior to timber harvests being on the landscape. Fire would have removed a lot of the older, larger trees on the landscape and created this patchwork of habitat that the spotted owls would have been living in prior to timber harvests. And then population dynamics, which is what our main focus was there. They've helped in developing things like occupancy models. They were a case study in in the first multi-season occupancy model paper. And all these, not that you need this for occupancy models, but a lot of this research and the population dynamics were done with this large monitoring network where we were individually marking spotted owls with these leg tags that you'd be able to spot and ID individuals from the ground. So here is the big monitoring network that was set up in the 90s. We have quite a few study areas spread throughout the range and different types of ecosystems to understand the population dynamics that are going on in drier habitats, wetter habitats, high elevation, low elevation, to try and see how our management efforts are helping spotted owls. So I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs from this Anthony et al. Paper that came out in 2006, analyzing population trends in all of these study areas. So what we're looking at here is simply, we have the point all the way on the left is the first survey for a given population. And then each of these points is just the proportion of population change in that year relative to the first year the population was studied. So we see here, spotted owls were listed as threatened in 1990. 1994 was the Northwest Forest Plan. We see their populations kind of teeter back and forth, a little bit below the initial population level. But then towards the end of this study, we see in this study area, Tyee, here in Western Oregon, we start to see a little bit of an increase, and which is what we would expect. It takes time for these forests to grow and measures to get put in place. So we see a little bit of an increase here. So starting at the south, for the longest running study area, starting in 1987, we see they kind of stayed constant. And then in the early 90s, there was slight decrease. Confidence intervals overlap 1, but the estimates are all under 1 in the later years. Here, this area is really interesting. This is industrial timberlands. It's the only privately owned industrial timberlands included in this large monitoring network. They joined the study a little bit later, but here in 1995, we see a little bit of a decline. Not many people would be surprised for industrial timberlands. The population, spotted owl population, not doing all that great. Here in study area in Southern Oregon, we see, again, kind of teetering below their initial population size, but remaining relatively constant. And here, we're a little bit concerned because we have this large coast range study area, a lot of habitat set aside in there, but we're starting to get estimates towards the end of this study period that are below their initial population size, as well. The confidence intervals are also below that initial population size at the beginning of the study. Then we come up here to Cle Elum, which is on the east side of the Cascades. This is really dry. We're starting to see the population is getting close to half of what it was at the beginning of the survey period in the mid-90s, after spotted owls received a bunch of protection. And then the Rainier study area, this includes Rainier National Park, Mount Rainier National Park, as well as some outlying areas. And the population at the end of this study period was half of that which it was at the beginning of the study period. So this raised a lot of concerns for people. And there was a little indication in 1990 of what might be going on. So for the listing decision under the Endangered Species Act, they had to put this out for public comment, and anyone in America can make comments on the listing decision prior to it getting listed. And there were a few commenters, but this one noted that there are barred owls in the Pacific Northwest, and they might be competing with northern spotted owls. And at the time, in 1990, there wasn't a whole lot of research on this. We knew barred owls were out there, but they weren't in very high abundance. And the U.S. Fish and Wild Service, the organization that listed the spotted owls as endangered, noted that we really just don't know if competition between northern spotted owls and barred owls is having an impact or will have an impact on northern spotted owl populations. So we'll backtrack a little bit back to the frontier. As I noted, throughout the middle of the United States, there are open prairies with not much forest. So as European American settlers were moving to the West Coast, many of them settled in the middle of the country before getting to the West Coast. And over the decades, actions were taken that essentially just removed all the bison off the landscape and removed all of the Native Americans off the landscape. Both of which suppressed tree growth and maintained the prairie. So the bison obviously trampled and ate everything that was out there, and the trees couldn't grow up around that. And then Native Americans also set fires on the prairie, which prevented trees from growing out there. And in addition to removing those processes that stopped tree growth, many of the settlers planted shelter trees to prevent wind from blowing through them through their homesteads constantly. So with trees now in the landscape in the late 19th century, this allowed a forest obligate owl to hopscotch across the continent. And here's a compilation from Kent Livesey, a review of all the records of barred owls across the continent. We see here out on the in eastern North America, their native range. They start moving out, kind of tracking what we would expect as European Americans settled this region. So several decades after they settled this region, you start having trees large enough to support barred owls to move across the landscape. And then we see here in the mid 20th century, we're starting to get a lot of occurrences of barred owls along the West Coast. So back to our northern spotted owl, we call medium-sized, territorial, non-migratory, long-lived, low fecundity, forest obligate. We now have barred owls entering the picture in their range along the West Coast, and they are also medium-sized, territorial, non-migratory, long-lived, low fecundity, forest obligate owls. And if you know just about anything about ecology, you can't have two species that use the landscape in similar ways coexisting for very long. One of them is probably going to win out. So we knew barred owls were out there, but we didn't quite know what their exact impacts were on northern spotted owls. Some people suggested that it was predation. Barred owls are a little bit larger. There's been some studies and they're a little more aggressive, but we really don't have much evidence of too many spotted owls being preyed upon by barred owls. Hybridization, I hear a lot of concerns about hybridization, especially in the early teens. But a colleague of mine, Zach Hanna, did his PhD at UC Berkeley and the California Academy of Sciences, looking at the genomes of barred owls and spotted owls after barred owls have colonized the spotted owl range. And a lot of people were worried about this issue of hybridization and then back crossing and barred owls maybe diluting the spotted owl population. But his PhD showed that what we have here is barred owls on the left, spotted owls on the right, a few hybrids in the middle. And aside from those first F1 hybrids, we don't see any introgression of spotted owl and barred owl genes between the two populations. So while we know hybridization is occurring out there on the landscape, it doesn't seem to be going back. There's no introgression into either of those species populations. So we're not too concerned about hybridization as a problem in this conservation issue. So then it comes down to competition. So they are likely competing for space. This is a time series. This is a single study area, the Thais study area. And here in 1990, each of these little polygons within the study area is a spotted owl territory, home range. And then each of the ones in black is a spotted owl home range with a barred owl detected in it. So in 1990, at the time spotted owls were listed, we have 4 home ranges with spotted owl or with barred owls detected within them. And then over the ensuing 2 decades, I haven't gone through and counted up all of these home ranges. I think it's listed in the paper, but a very large portion of this study area was occupied by barred owls. And as barred owls show up, spotted owls start disappearing. And then food. This is a little trickier to get at than looking at space use, and it's what I'll be touching upon later. So with the decades of research, looking between interactions between these two species, pretty much every single demographic parameter we measure of spotted owls decreases in the presence of barred owls, except for site level extinction rates. So at a spotted owl territory, you're much more likely to not find a spotted owl the next year if there's a barred owl present in that territory. So we have a little bit of an idea of what's going on, but then we have to ask what we're going to do about this. One option is always do nothing. We can let nature take its course. Some people feel this is the way we should proceed. Some people think spotted owls will adapt and be able to persist with barred owls on the landscape. A little optimistic. Some people suggest focusing on just habitat, try and find some differences in habitat usage between spotted owls and barred owls and try and create a landscape that's suited to spotted owls, but not for barred owls. And unfortunately, there have been a lot of habitat studies for both of these species, and anything spotted owls can use for habitat, barred owls can also use for habitat, but barred owls can also use much more of the landscape out there. They can use younger forests that spotted owls we don't find them in. And lastly, really the only other option is to remove barred owls from the landscape. Lethal removal is one option. Some other people are more comfortable with trying to capture them live and send them places like zoos. But there's really just not the capacity for that, and it's an incredibly expensive option trying to transport live animals across the country. Some people say release them back into their native range on the east, but their populations are doing just fine out there. And when you translocate animals like that, oftentimes the animal's just going to end up dying when you drop it off in a new habitat that it's unfamiliar with and that's already occupied by conspecifics. So, removing owls lethally. There was a status review of their endangered status under the Endangered Species, or threatened status under the Endangered Species Act in 2011 that strongly urged considering removals as a management option. And then in that review, they also say we should not stop protecting habitat. Nobody says don't protect spotted owl habitat out there. It's just that if we focus exclusively on protecting spotted owl habitat, what we're probably doing is just protecting barred owl habitat in the long run if we don't do anything about barred owls. So there was an early pilot study on actually those industrial timberlands in Northern California that I mentioned earlier. I was a technician on this study for several years of it going on, and they found pretty good results. So this is mean lambda, so growth rate of populations. So these are all the populations in that long-term monitoring study. The first one I showed you were the results published in 2006, and these are results published a decade later in 2016. And we see for all of the study areas, their estimated growth rate was below 1, so all estimated to be shrinking populations. A few of these study areas had confidence intervals that barely overlapped 1, so they might be holding steady, likely not, but there's this one outlier where the estimate is above 1, so it's estimated to have a growing population. Confidence interval still overlaps 1, so it might be steady, it might be decreasing, but it's the only one estimated to be growing. And this estimate was in the treatment area where they were actively removing barred owls on their landscape. And it's the only area in this massive study across the range of the northern spotted owl to have estimated a positive growth rate of the spotted owl population where they're removing barred owls. So that was some early evidence that barred owl removal has a positive impact on spotted owls. And with those results, the federal government initiated a large-scale removal across 4 of the study areas included in that monitoring network to see if barred owl removal actually does have an impact and how viable this is as a management action. So everything I've talked about up to now has been on spotted owls, and most of the research regarding barred owls has been on their impact on spotted owls. Although barred owls live in these complex ecosystems with many other species other than spotted owls out there, And we really don't understand what their impacts are, what barred owl impacts are on the rest of the ecosystem beyond spotted owls. So this removal study gives us an excellent opportunity to look at the diets of barred owls. So basic question is, what are they eating out there? And then we can also use this removal study to investigate how their diet is influencing the barred owls themselves. So these are two primary questions for my PhD back at Oregon State. So the collection of barred owls, we have these study areas broken up into before, after, control, impact study designs. Here, the red zones are where barred owls are being removed, and the black zones are controls where they're not being removed. Crews went out and surveyed each of these hexagons, which are 500 hectares, roughly the size of a barred owl home range. And before removals initiated, they surveyed the entire study area to see where barred owls occurred. And then as they moved forward, they removed barred owls from these red zones, but continued to survey for them throughout the entire study area to see if there's truly a reduction in barred owls in the removal areas, and if spotted owls increase, if it's just an increase in the removal areas, or if there's something else going on the landscape, we might see an increase in the control areas. So 3 study areas I'm working with are these Cle Elum, Coast Range, and Klamath study areas. There's a 4th run by somebody else in Northern California near that pilot study area on the industrial timberlands. So Cle Elum is on the east side of the Cascade Range in Washington. It's high elevation, relatively open forest structures up here. Most of their precipitation comes as snow in the winter, and they have pretty hot, dry summers out there. The Coast Range is very wet, pretty mild and stable climate year-round. The summers get warm, but not incredibly hot. And then most of the precipitation comes as rain throughout the fall, winter, and spring. Pretty rainy out there. And then we have this Klamath study area, which is kind of intermediate between the two, but it's also intensively managed. And if you recall that checkerboard area that I showed you earlier, that satellite image came near this area. So much of this study area looks like that checkerboard, excuse me, with intensively managed private lands and federal lands with some older forests on them. So for my study area, again, I'll be using these abbreviations for CLE for Cle Elum, COA for Coast Range, and KLA for Klamath. The removals took place between 2015 and 18, so 3 years worth of removals in the Cle Elum and Coast Range study areas. And we had 3 years of removals that started a year later in the Klamath study area. In Cle Elum, due to access issues, they didn't do much removal in the non-breeding season. So during the winter, and then in Coast Range and Klamath, they did removals year-round starting after the first year of removal. And for my study, this resulted in 227 owls collected in Cle Elum, 625 collected in Coast Range, and Klamath had 473. And these sort of represent what the populations look like out there. So incredibly dense barred owl population in Coast Range, pretty sparse barred owl population in Cle Elum, and intermediate in the Klamath study area. So this is the distribution of removals over the year. So this is starting in January, going to December. We see peaks here in March where they're removing them prior to individuals. This is the beginning of the breeding season, so they're trying to remove barred owls before they would have dependent young on the nest. And they're very actively calling during this period, so it's very easy to find them. They stop removals during the breeding season unless they're relatively confident that that pair of barred owls does not have dependent young on the nest. And then coming out of the breeding season in September, the removals ramp up again, and this is where many of the barred owls are being collected in very late summer and early fall. So stomach content analysis, pretty straightforward. We remove the stomachs from the carcasses, weigh the contents, and then identify and count what we find inside. And you're probably familiar, pellets, owls in general produce pellets, and many, many diet studies rely on this. But there are some differences between stomachs and pellets, namely you're getting half-digested things. But you also know exactly what was in that barred owl, what it had eaten prior to being collected. Whereas with pellets, you oftentimes have a pile of pellets underneath a roost or a nest. So you can collect those all up and give it some general time period, say the previous month, previous year. Whereas stomachs let you know exactly what was in that owl during that foraging period, during that evening. So I wasn't the first person to look at diets of barred owls. There had been some prior research. One of my advisors, Dave Weens with USGS, had done some comparison between spotted owls and barred owls near the Coast Range study area. So spotted owls, this first bar in green, almost exclusively mammals. And of those mammals, the big three that I mentioned before, lots of flying squirrels, quite a few tree voles, and a few wood rats showing up, a few other things, but not too much. And then we see a few arthropods and a few birds, and then amphibians and I think one or two amphibians and a few snails. So almost exclusively relying on mammals, and those three mammals, the flying squirrels, tree voles, and wood rats. Kent Livesey, the one who compiled the range map that I showed you earlier, he also did a review of barred owl diets from across their range in both their native on the east and their new range on the west. And again, largely mammals, with a smattering of a few more things to increase the diversity. Some arthropods, amphibians, birds, crayfish show up every so often, and then reptiles, and every so often you'll get a fish in their diets. But again, largely mammals for barred owl diets from across their range. And then what Dave found in that Coast Range pellet study is, again, largely mammals, a few more arthropods and amphibians than we see throughout the range, and snails show up quite a bit too. The mammals that barred owls are eating out there, they're still eating flying squirrels, still eating tree voles, but they're also taking some of the terrestrial insectivores like shrews and shrew moles a little more frequently than we see in spotted owls. Spotted owls like going for the arboreal prey, and barred owls seem to be spending a lot of their time on the ground. So for my study, I'll first present prey diversity and then some prey counts. And I have data on prey biomass, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to run this talk down to the very end of the clock. So I'm not going to talk about biomass, but the biomass tracks what we see with the prey counts pretty well. So what did we find? We found vertebrates, arthropods, gastropods, one possible worm. I was hoping to find more of these soft-bodied preys like worms and slugs, since we're working with stomach contents. In a pellet, you're just not going to be able to find something like an earthworm or a slug. But with stomach contents, I was hopeful we'd see some of them, but they really just didn't show up all that much. So to start with, I'll go into what we found for vertebrates. So mammals, amphibians, birds, reptiles, fish, everything you would expect, all the vertebrates that are out there. Fish, we only got a handful of them, so I won't go into them too deeply. Reptiles, birds, amphibians, I'll get into. So for mammals, the major groups we found: insectivores, rodents, and lagomorphs. Just like Dave found, shrews, shrew moles, and moles quite often. All of the rodents that were out there, we have those tree voles along with the terrestrial voles that are out there on the landscape. They're taking just about all of the sciurids, the squirrels, the chipmunks, flying squirrels, Douglas squirrels, gray squirrels, These gray squirrels are quite big, and the barred owls that took the gray squirrels, I think, have got to be pretty brave barred owls. Wood rats, just like we find with spotted owls. Mountain beavers. So this is not Castor canadensis. This is not the big beavers. These are much smaller, about rabbit size, but they're still pretty good prey items out there. And then few others like gophers, jumping mice, and invasive rats. Hares, rabbits, pika, one pika up at the high elevation in Cleellum. And then a few others. We had one possible weasel, a few opossums, and then a few bats. So again, we're quite beyond what we normally would find in spotted owls and even most barred owl studies. And then quite a few amphibians. So just about any salamander we found out there on the landscape, or that could be out there, we found inside the barred owls. One of the surprising ones down here in the corner is the Ruffskin Newt, which is incredibly toxic. And it should be killing barred owls. It should be killing anything that eats it, except for garter snakes that have evolved to eat these guys. But we found several barred owls with quite a few newts in their stomachs. We were just missing one small aquatic salamander species, but it's really tough to identify these guys down to species. There's not much to go off with their bones, and usually the skin is completely digested by the time we have collected the barred owls. Frogs and toads, quite a few in there. The only ones we could identify positively were these tree frogs. Quite a few other species, but again, their skin digests off pretty fast. Birds, identifying these guys by bone is pretty tough, but we have quite a few that we got enough indication. And then we had a few raptors show up inside the barred owls, and one case of clear nest predation because an egg was inside the barred owl stomach. And then our reptiles. Again, these are a pain to sift through. Lots of ribs, lots of vertebrae, but we get a few intact with their scales still on them where we can identify them. A few lizards. And then the arthropods were surprising. We found quite a few of these guys that I'll get into. Those are rain beetles. Quite a few carabid ground beetles. Some longhorn beetles, which make for a pretty good meal. Those will be as big as your thumb oftentimes. Quite a few other beetle species. And again, the point here, we are finding a lot more inside the stomachs than most people will be finding with the pellets. And then a smattering of other random insects. And our smallest, I'd say that we're pretty sure the barred owls took themselves, not secondary predation by eating some other insectivore. We found barred owls with ants in their stomach. Nothing else in the stomach that could have been eating the ants. So the barred owls were just going around plucking ants off the ground. And then spiders, a few scorpions, centipedes, millipedes. These guys might be secondary predation, as we only ever found them with large giant salamanders. And then crayfish, definitely have to be finding these in the water, and they'll show up every so often. So that's what we found, but how much of it did we find? So of the 1,325 stomachs we analyzed, nearly 5,000 prey items total. averaged about 3 3/4 prey atoms per stomach. We had quite a few empty stomachs, which happens when you're working with stomach contents. Some of them just didn't have anything in them. And then the max we found was in one stomach, we had 74 individual prey atoms, which took it quite a while to go through. So here's our distribution of prey items. Again, quite a few empties, a lot of stomachs with just a single prey item in them, and then we taper off out here to that one with 74. So across all 3 study areas, we find mammals are only about 25% of the prey, while arthropods are nearly 45% of the prey. Excuse me. And amphibians make up 25, and then we have our other random things out there. So in our Cle-Elum study area, we got about 40% mammals, about 40% arthropods, and then the amphibians that we were finding up there, largely frogs. Then our Coast Range study area, over 40% of the prey items taken were amphibians. These are mostly salamanders, and small salamanders at that. So we have our giant salamanders out there, which you'd think a large bird of prey would go after, but these guys were just taking the small, tiny, slender salamanders that we have. And then our Klamath study area, about 65% of the prey items found were arthropods. And a lot of these were those rain beetles. And most of those are coming in at around October, September. October, November. So how does this compare with the prior research on barred owl diets? So this is this red bar. These barred owls were collected very close to this green bar here, or this gray bar here, where Dave Wiens did his prior research. So again, he found mostly mammals, but we see a really big drop off in the number of mammals and a lot more amphibians being taken out there, which raises some questions as to why we're seeing this difference. It could be methodological. Maybe it's much easier to find amphibians in this analyzing stomach contents, whereas with pellets, you're inherently going to be finding mammals because you need the mammals to form the pellets with their fur. But some people are concerned that maybe what we're seeing is a shift in the prey community. And in the years since Dave did his diet work out in the study area, barred owls perhaps have eroded all those mammal prey that they were taking at that time, and they've had to now shift to taking more arthropods and more amphibians as lower quality prey because they've already eaten through many of the other preferred prey items that are mammals for them. So jumping on to the second aspect, looking at how this affects, how their diets affect them. This is still preliminary work. We have, I've done some additional work to this that's not ready to share yet. So as we were opening barred owls up to extract the stomachs for this analysis, we saw a range in the amount of fat barred owls had deposited. So over the course of these dissections, we developed a fat scoring criterion. Over here, we have one where we found no fat, subcutaneous fat on the barred owls, up to a 4 where we have very thick deposits of fat on the barred owls. This was one of the fattest owls we found. This came in with 2 centimeters of subcutaneous fat. And then when we opened the barred owl up, the viscera, the abdominal cavity was just completely filled with visceral fat. So whatever this barred owl, wherever this barred owl lived, whatever it was eating, it was getting by just fine. So we found some pretty big differences between females here on the left and males here on the right. Females are packing on a lot more fat than the males. We see pretty big variation throughout the year. So oftentimes we think of the winter as the really lean times of year where it's hard to find food. But here, starting in September, going into December, and then coming back over here to the left, coming out in January, going into the breeding season, that period, they are just loaded with fat. And in January, we had relatively low collections during this time, but all the individuals had significant fat deposits on them at that time of year. And then they're coming out of the breeding season in August and September, pretty much completely spent of all of their fat reserves. And then across our three study areas, forgive me, Cleellum, that high elevation, very cold climate, we find very few owls with fat on them, this is also the area with the lowest barred owl density, as opposed to Coast Range, incredibly dense, where we find quite a few owls with high fat deposits on them. But then here in the Klamath, this was very surprising. We see the most owls in our fat score of 4 with very thick fat deposits on them. This is the area that's intensively managed for timber harvests. So it doesn't seem to be bothering the barred owls too much out there. And then the fattest owls that we're finding are getting collected just after the period where we're finding them gorging themselves on rain beetles in October and November. So this leaves many more questions, as most PhDs do, as to what the ramifications are of barred owls eating such different prey out there on the landscape than spotted owls. So people, like I said, some people suggest barred owls could be a functional replacement of northern spotted owls on the landscape. But there are a lot of things out there that were not eaten by spotted owls that are now being heavily preyed upon by barred owls, such as salamanders. And we have salamanders with incredibly small ranges. Their range maps will just be just a dot on the map. And I worry what happens to those as barred owls just fill in and hunt them. And then are we seeing that they're taking things like arthropods and maybe salamanders, and we get some apparent competition where those highly abundant prey are supporting higher populations of barred owls that can then target their, say, more preferred prey, like flying squirrels. And that's why we're seeing far fewer flying squirrels in their diets, because possibly their populations have declined. So this what to do about barred owls is complex. I've been working with barred owls and barred owl removals for a decade now. I don't have a clear answer on what we should do about them. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is mandated to protect spotted owls. And if barred owls are a threat to spotted owls, they have to manage barred owls somehow. But we fought for decades to try and keep a medium-sized brown forest owl in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. And now we have a medium-sized brown forest owl that seems to be perfectly suited in the forests that we've created and the forests that are probably going to continue to exist for the foreseeable future. So this is a tough question of what we should do. It's complicated by the fact that they are such similar species as well. And why should we care about this in Spain? Well, we have species that are coming out here. You have the common buzzard, the ratonero. Seems to be doing okay, but you're starting to have long-legged buzzards come up from Africa. Additionally, we have Eurasian griffon vultures, where we have Ruppel's vultures and whiteback vultures coming up from Africa. And these are the early forays of these novel species coming up. This is essentially where we were with barred owls in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And there's a lot we can understand and a lot we can think about in how we want the landscape and our animal communities to look. And I don't know that shooting these new animals coming up from Africa is going to be the right answer. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. But moving on, I do have a lot of people to thank who have helped me with all the lab work. It would have been impossible to count nearly 5,000 prey items, many of them very small salamander bones and arthropods. And the people who have helped support the research and make it happen, and especially my funders, USGS and NSF. And if anyone has questions and I have any time left, I'm happy to answer.
So thank you so much, Ryan. It's a very beautiful talk. I'm sure the people has enjoyed a lot all this natural history of the owls, and also linked to the history of the United States. Very, very beautiful. And there is a question from Carlos Villa in the chat. So he says, great talk. At the beginning, you were showing a figure with the change in population size in each location and year by year. I don't know if you can go back, if you remember which one was it. With the different sites and how the population was declining over time.
Oh, yeah. Let's see if I can do that. Oh, sorry.
Anyway, if you remember, he was asking why are the confidence intervals increasing through time?
That's an excellent question.
That one.
So far back, yeah. No, that's an excellent question because we're collecting more data over time. So you think our confidence intervals would be getting smaller, but over time we're getting fewer spotted owls on the landscape. So with the statistical methods that they're using, we have more years of data, but we have fewer individuals in those later years in the study areas. So our confidence intervals are getting bigger.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is, creating problems for this long-term monitoring network because we're essentially getting so few owls out there. We're getting study areas where we can't generate population estimates, like reliable population estimates anymore because we just have so few. This study area up here, this is the Olympic Peninsula. Like I want to say there are single-digit number pairs of spotted owls out there. It's just things do not look good in Washington. And right now the update to this study, so there was a 2016 one. The most current analysis took place last year, I believe, and they're waiting, I believe, on review to publish the results of that study.
Do you think, I'm going to ask for the take-home message. So do you think if the spotted owls are decreasing by a combination of a habitat destruction, habitat change, plus the barrel owl, or is, if you remove the barrel owl, you will have a huge increase? Do you need to have the two factors, or only habitat destruction is going to be enough? What do you think about that?
It's tough. So if we just were to tackle one and not the other, I don't think spotted owls would recover. I think if we allowed timber harvest to take place anywhere and we didn't protect any spotted owl habitat, but we took care of the barred owl issue, there'd just be no habitat for spotted owls, so we'd have a problem there. And if we just protect habitat but don't deal with the barred owls, all we're really doing is protecting barred owl habitat in the long run. Some people like to think that barred owls are making use of a degraded landscape, but I worked in Northern California for a while, and we have Redwood National Park, which has huge old trees that have never been cut over. And in that area, the national park was one of the first places to fill up with barred owls as they were moving into the landscape.
So, but what at the end, how do you explain this advantage of the barred owls? Because they can use, it's because they use more habitat and more trees than the spotted ones?
Probably. Kent Livesey, who I cited some of his papers in this, he has a really good statement at the end of, I believe it's one of the papers he does looking at barred owl diets, and he comments on how many spotted owls have gone hungry looking down a creek that's full of salamanders and fish and slugs and snails that barred owls can make use of, but spotted owls for some reason won't eat. And it's almost frustrating looking at this landscape that one owl can use so well and that another owl that is almost identical just can't make use of for some reason.
I see. I think Mari also has some questions for you.
Yeah, I have, because we don't have that much time, so I'm going to ask you one question. So it's really interesting talk from the historic point of view. It's been really, really nice to look at it. I didn't know in detail the timber wars and what the northern owl represented. So it has been very nice to see that. So the removal of barred owls, that is a major, one of the major factors in the protecting, to protect northern owls. But I was thinking, what does the public think, the general public think about that? So is there any movement saying that's not, because here in Spain, I don't know if you've heard, like parrots, like some people wants to, like, some people thinks that removal is the best option to control the populations, but there's a lot of people that says that that's not the way to do it. So there is a lot of like conflict, different point of view. So I don't know if there is like a public opinion in the United States about removing barred owls.
No, there certainly is, and there's the full spectrum of opinions on it. It's like this issue is complicated by the fact that you can imagine many of the people who wanted to protect old growth forests and wanted to protect old growth forests of spotted owls are not crazy about the idea of shooting barred owls to protect spotted owls.
Yes.
It's a pretty big conundrum. The larger federal removal experiment that I've been working as a part of, that these owls were collected under, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did a fantastic job before initiating all of that and reaching out to a really diverse range of stakeholders, including timber companies, federal agencies, but also animal rights groups, tribal reservations, and talking to them and providing them the information and providing them the science to show them what's going on the ground and to talk about what the consequences are for spotted owls if we don't move forward with barred owl removals or even consider barred owl removals. And I find, this issue ends up in the news a lot, and there are some really easy ways to go about presenting this in the news and highlighting how terrible it is shooting barred owls. I've been there for removals. Like, I don't find it pleasant or enjoyable whatsoever. But I also, I've worked on these studies for a long time, and I've gone into places where you find in the historic spotted owl territory where spotted owls did well, you find a barred owl pair there, and you call in, you let the removal crews know that barred owls are there. And I had one instance where I did this, and the supervisor went out, he removed the barred owls, and the next time I went out there to survey for spotted owls, like there was the spotted owl that had previously been occupying that territory. Like it just essentially flown under the radar, was trying not to get detected by the barred owls there. And I find that when I talk with people and just present them the science, and I don't tell them what the right way to go about doing it is. I understand if somebody's not comfortable with shooting barred owls, I'm not comfortable entirely with shooting barred owls. But when you present people with the science and show them what we know and what the consequences are of not taking action, people are smart and they understand that.
Yeah, nice. And also, because there are 3 different states and the different places, some of them are like national parks, others are state parks, so there are reservations which have different laws, if I remember this well.
Yep, right.
The different states, each reservation has a different law. Like, does the Endangered Species Act have into account all these differences in legislation? It depends on the states, or how does that work?
Yeah, I'm not a policy wonk, so I don't understand all of the nuances of this, but one of the major challenges if we want to actively manage barred owls through lethal removal, the biggest challenge is going to be dealing with the policy of each of the individual states, each of the individual landowners and managers for the various governments, because we have state-owned, county-owned, city-owned, federally owned. So the biggest challenge there will be dealing with that. And barred owls, we have something called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which provides protection to just about anything that's not a grouse or a quail. That's a bird, and barred owls are covered under that. So the removal experiments have had to get permission under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to do the removals.
Thank you.
Ryan, there is a question by Chris Litke. And he says, hey, Ryan, thanks for the beautiful Dolly story. Are you looking further into how owls are seemingly tolerant to toxic newts? Could it be reading the coevolution story like the garter snakes?
Yeah, so a little bit. I'm incredibly interested in that. An undergraduate student working with me, we just published just a very brief note on these occurrences, the newt predation taking place. We got that published this year, and we want to try and get her to explore some other aspects of this. There are some researchers, they found a case of this in Northern California as well, where a couple barred owls, they found a dead barred owl. They found a dead barred owl with a whole newt inside of it, but then they also collected a barred owl with a digested newt inside of it. So it occurs down there, but this map I have up here, this big Coast Range study area, if you're familiar with newt toxicity, this is the epicenter. These are the hottest, most toxic newts that are out there. And it sort of trails off, and the barred owls collected with the newts were down in this study area, still pretty high toxicity. And I was just sent this week a photo, a camera trap photo from the Tai study area, which is in the middle, where they think they got a photo or video of a barred owl eating a newt right out of a creek in the study area. So yeah, it's really fascinating. And I've been talking with some people, and we wanted to develop some more on that. So stay tuned.
So, but you don't have an idea, no? Why they can be tolerant to toxicity?
No. And newts occur throughout their range. So I'm really curious why we only found newts in this study area, where this study area was the one where they're eating just tons and tons of salamanders, but we didn't find any bones that seemed like they were newt bones in this study area. So we can go back through our collection and try and do some genetics and see if we missed some newts somehow, but I'm pretty sure we didn't find any newts in here. So I'd really like to know if newts are less toxic here than in the Coast Range, how barred owls know not to eat the highly toxic newts in this area, while these newts are safe to eat down here.
Yeah, this could be a nice project. I mean, I have also, Miguel. Okay, there's another question. Ryan, could you switch off the screen like this? We can see your face bigger.
Oh, okay, sure.
And Miguel Tejedo he's asking. He's saying the interesting possibility of arms races between owls and Toxitarchila newts. So he's also interested on the story. Yeah, it's very cool. In fact, if you could.
Christophe said also, I have seen raptors, because there are two of Christophe. I think
sorry, I missed that one. Sorry, Christophe.
Christophe said, after you were answering the question, I have seen raptors eating toxic toads by flipping them over and avoiding the toxic parotid glands. Perhaps there are some behavioral adaptations that birds can do that snakes can't. So maybe,
yeah, possibly. And it's been a while since I've looked at the bones in them, but I know the skin's toxic on the newts, and we see tail bones, leg bones, head bones in them, so they're eating the whole newt going in. And if I remember correctly, I think our record for that, we had one barred owl with maybe 14 individual newts in the stomach. Oh, wow. Another one with 9 individual newts in the stomach, and the 2 other owls we found had just a handful of newts in them. So.
Yeah, it's very cool. I mean, I have 2 questions more, but I don't know if we have time for that. But anyway, I think I'm gonna ask the question that August would ask you. August was not possible to come today. He's also the co-organizer of the seminar, and he's always interested in the thermic tolerance of a species, no? And I wonder have you checked that about the 2 owls, if there is a difference in the thermic tolerance, and maybe this can be an explanation why barred owls are going so well now, that they are expanding more than the spotted ones, because they are appearing in areas where they're not appearing before, right? So, and the habitat degradation has occurred for the last 1 century or more. So maybe there is a climatic reason behind this expansion of the barred owls. Have you tested that? Do you have any data on that?
I haven't done that, and I haven't seen anything on the thermal tolerances of barred owls and their expansion. So they hit the West Coast kind of at the Canada-US border, and they've been expanding southward from there. So they're going against what we expect with a lot of range shifts with climate change, where we expect ranges going north. I know early on people were thinking maybe barred owls will just stay in Washington and they won't come down through the entire range of the northern spotted owl. And then they made it to Oregon, and people in California said maybe the barred owls are going to stay in Oregon and Washington. Then they made it to California. And they've been moving through our Sierra Nevada mountains along Eastern California. And we have records, if you look at eBird, there are records of barred owls at the very southern tip of the Sierra Nevada range in California. And there's some active management going on out there. Barred owl numbers are much lower out there, so it looks like it might be easier to manage them. And we might not be seeing them going into the mountain ranges surrounding Los Angeles. But
yeah, so maybe the barred one it is more like thermic tolerant, so it can resist better higher temperatures, whereas the spotted one, he is not able. So it's for that maybe it's reducing its area, and the other one is increasing.
In that area, that's the range of the California spotted owl. So we have spotted owls in that region. It's just a different subspecies. And barred owls seem to be doing just fine by all indications in that area.
Okay, I see. And then the last question, I think, is about have you tried to use a network approach for your prey-predator, for your diet analysis? Because I think that could be very, very cool. I mean, you have the diet, the barred owls are having every time, no? So you can try to put that in a network and see, how it's changing, for instance, across sites or across time, because you have different sites and you also have temporal sampling. So you can see how is the network is changing, the trophic network is changing through time. Have you tried that? Do you think it would be interesting for you, or do you think?
I have not. Is this your question or somebody else's?
No, this is my question. This is my comment.
Yeah, we should talk later about it.
Okay, sure. I think that could bring you some maybe some insights or something interesting. Yeah. Okay, I think nobody else is asking anything else. So thank you so much, Ryan, for this wonderful seminar, traveling into the United States and knowing much more about your study species. Next week, we will have another seminar by Hector Aguilera from the IGME. This one will be about underground water in Doñana. So a very different topic from today. So see you next week, and thank you so much.
All right, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.